So the UNEP Finance Initiative, or UNEP FI, is a global partnership between the UN and the finance community. It's composed today of about 220 of the larger banks, insurers, and investment managers globally. About half of our membership comes from OECD, or developed countries, and about half from emerging markets, developing countries. And the work program, what we do with these big banks, insurers, is essentially looking at how do you bring to the mainstream of the financial markets, to financial strategy and implementation, the notion of environmental, social, and governance, including particularly today climate considerations. What does it mean for mainstream business? What does it mean for finance in terms of how we're going to both look at the risks and making sure we're not putting the capital into the wrong sort of activities, but also increasingly the opportunities that are going to be coming up and are already presenting themselves in the areas of climate, low carbon, energy generation, or more broadly the notion of sustainable development. Essentially, where is capital going to be required to generate the types of economic and sustainable returns as we move forward, and within the UN, what we call the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Our latest initiative is around the notion of SDG and the financing gap that exists, and the notion that you start to get the investment community increasingly interested, and this comes out of different pockets, particularly in Europe. We're talking about Northern Europe, the Netherlands, to some extent France, also in North America and Canada, and to some extent starting in the US. The idea that shareholders, stakeholders of pension funds particularly are increasingly interested and feeling that sustainable development is important. And so investors are starting to say, okay, well, we can start to invest capital into the sustainable development markets, and yet the frameworks of exactly what is SDG compliant investment in financial products and services is not yet known. And therefore, this is a group within UNEP FI of banks, investors, and insurers who are starting to define, establish a framework for essentially what is SDG compliant finance. Two examples I would speak to is Société Générale, which is one of the largest French banking groups, has issued a number of positive impact bonds. So essentially they're going out into the markets. It's like green bonds, but it's a more holistic approach, which looks not only essentially at what's green in the portfolio, but also takes into account what is brown and what is actually being done to reduce the brown or the negative environmental impact of a bond issuance. So it's a little bit more holistic approach to ESG analysis, and it gives more what we would say within our organizations is the notion that you can not only look at green going forward, you have to actually be able to balance green versus brown within the more broader sustainable development picture. I mean, it's certainly an interesting period. We're almost 2 years since Paris was signed. We are in a state of geopolitical concern on many levels, including what's going in the Korean Peninsula and in terms of the migration crisis in Europe, international terrorism, and most recently the hurricanes, which we've seen come through into Central and North America. Key question for the finance community is, does that mean that there's an uncertainty, market trepidation in terms of the desire to move forward into this sustainable development economy? And I think as we've seen here today, and the critical measure we can take is that the investment community is not backing off. The banks are not turning away. Essentially, the scaling up in market activity continues at pace, even as political cycles maybe are not all fully supportive all the time. And I think we read it as a very positive signal that the financial markets overall, they look at both what's happening today globally, both in terms of geopolitics, in terms of country commitments to processes like the Paris Climate Agreement, but also in terms of environmentally and socially, and realize that the writing is on the wall and that the solutions are going to need to be developed. The financing opportunities are going to be there, and therefore the need for action is now. I mean, this has been a fantastic partnership between the UN, UNEP FI, and Climate Action. We've been doing it for a number of years, and we're very pleased Across town, we have the UN General Assembly that's just getting started, which is governments coming together to talk about many global challenges, including those of sustainable development. And the reality is what goes on in here today in this conference, where you show it about making business, about this is an investment case, about we have to come up with some of the solutions, not only to our business strategies, but to essentially our economies and our societies. This is really where the action is. And the ability to bring together public and private, this is where you're going to create the solutions to move forward. What goes on here today is not only about doing business, but it's also about sending signals across town to the governments to understand that we need to ratchet up in terms of our actions to address climate change and other aspects of sustainable development.